2020, what a year. I think none of us really expected at the start of 2020 that we'd all have to become broadcast engineers. But COVID has had a major impact on how church runs, how it does its services, how it engages with people. So Dan Bowalter's asked me to come down to London today and have a chat with Jake Rudd. So for those of you that don't know, Jake Rudd looks after all things audio for Hillsong UK. So we're going to have a chat today about broadcast, COVID, how Hillsong have basically steered their way through this, and hopefully answer some questions that you might have about dealing with a broadcast mix. So Jake, first of all, thanks for talking to us today.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, what a year 2020's been. So the start of 2020, everything was all guns blazing at Hillsong. You were meeting in, well, all over the country, 4 services at the Dominion Theatre.
Yeah.
And then COVID happened and the whole country locked down.
Yeah.
How did you deal with that? From an audio perspective and from a church perspective, talk us through the initial response to that.
Yeah. So it all happened very quickly. 1 minute we were in the Dominion on a Sunday doing services, and then that week the government advised that the public didn't go to venues or theatres. So we basically had to build a TV studio in Bermondsey Warehouse, and that Sunday we live streamed a service from the warehouse location.
In a week?
Yeah, in a week.
TV studio in a week?
Yeah. And then the second stage was when, the next week we went into the full lockdown. So we then did it from people's houses. So, for example, the MCs and the pastor would be speaking from their houses, and then those video and audio streams would land at the warehouse where it would be mixed live and streamed live.
Wow, so what a change. I mean, that's so different from a normal week for you.
Yeah.
So talk us through about streaming from people's houses. So if I understand correctly, you had pastors doing MCs and preaching from their houses.
Yeah.
So how did you go about that technically?
So from the pastor's house, we had a camera set up, an audio set up, and encoders, which would send the video and audio over the internet to the decoders at the warehouse, where it would appear as separate channels. And then for the guests who would be having conversations with the pastor, they would call in on a vMix system, which is like a comprehensive Skype. Yeah. So I would send everybody mix minuses, which is like a mix minus themselves, so they could hear the other person talking. Yeah. And then their audio would come back to me and I'd mix it the same way as you would a service, really.
So what was the main challenges of that season? So obviously people couldn't be in the warehouse, you were doing everything remotely. Yeah. How did you guys deal with the worship side of what you do?
Sure. So basically everybody recorded their instrument and their vocal at their own house. And then the audio and the video would be sent to the video editor and myself, and then we would piece it all together, mix it all down to make it sound like a cohesive, engaging worship set. And then that would get played out live on the Sunday.
Right, so that must have been a bit of a challenge, kind of taking all of these components and stitching it together. Yeah. To resemble something of a performance, something of a worship team playing together. Yeah,
I think the challenge was making sure it didn't sound too polished, but at the same time it sounds cohesive and engaging.
It's quite interesting that you say that, because Hillsong are quite renowned for quite a polished sound, quite a polished, slick service. So you were saying that you were trying to strike a balance between something that's believable.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Sure. Well, the brief that was set to us was this wasn't supposed to look and sound like a TV show. It was supposed to capture what church is, and it's supposed to be engaging so that we could maintain community. And we wanted it to feel like, for people at home, we wanted people to feel like they were a part of church still, and they were part of what was happening, opposed to people just consuming content.
Yeah.
And there's so much content out there. Why compete with that? Why not just do what we do?
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point, because there is so many churches now online streaming things. They can feel a pressure to put something out which is amazing and really engaging, but actually it needs to be representative of your church, your congregation, and that's the sticky thing that people come back to, is that sense of community and being involved.
Yeah, totally.
That's really cool. So in terms of, that was during sort of the strict lockdown, everyone was at home. Have you transitioned to something else now? Or are you still doing that, or are you doing something slightly different?
So at the moment, the Sunday service that goes out is captured at the warehouse with everybody in the warehouse live. So it's filmed start to finish with the MCs, the praise and worship with a band and vocals, and the preach. So it's captured live together in one space, opposed to it being in people's homes and things. Yeah. Occasionally, you still have vMix calls into guests, because you can meet at the moment in groups of 6. Yeah. Sometimes we're doing like vMixes into people's houses where they're doing church in their bubble.
In terms of what you're doing from a mix perspective, you're mixing broadcast, you're not mixing front of house for a room of people. Yeah. What are the differences, and how do you kind of approach that?
Yeah, good question. I think when you're mixing in the room, it's so forgiving from a Sonic's perspective. Yeah. And as soon as you record and put something out on TV, it's very unforgiving. So it was a real learning curve with just making sure things translated well between devices and in different people's homes, and making sure dynamic range was good. Yeah. And silly things like the last thing you want is for people to be riding the volume control on their TV. Yeah. Like between speech and music, keeping that consistent. And
That's great. I'm sure there's going to be people watching this that are, maybe making tentative steps into streaming. Yeah. Maybe they're not as far down the road as you guys. So what would you say to someone who's sort of starting out in streaming? Maybe they've got a front of house desk that has to do ears, front of house mix, and a stream. What type of things would you advise as a sort of a getting started for a good broadcast?
I think lots of testing is really helpful. So for example, listening back to how it sounds like on the other end, on the broadcast end, and making changes to reflect that. I think maybe having 2 separate stages of processing on your buses and your masters. So one for the room, and then one which is maybe has more of a shorter dynamic range, something that's tuned a bit differently for your broadcast, so that you can grab the 2 separately, because they are completely different.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting because when you are doing a broadcast mix, there could actually potentially be far more people watching your broadcast than are actually in the room.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's kind of switching the mindset of, we've been very focused on getting the room sounding great, which we should be, but also there's this whole other world now where, you could be a church of 200, but reaching thousands and thousands of people online. So I think there's a mentality shift for us as engineers that we have to start thinking about broadcast in a little bit more detail. Yeah. Well, I think we could talk about this for days, probably, because there's so many parts and things to talk about. But I think what's quite clear, we've been chatting about this anyway, I think broadcast is here to stay. I think, we've been forced into this situation, but actually I think there is a lot of positives that can be taken from being able to broadcast. And I know quite a few churches I've spoken to have no intention of stopping broadcast, even if we come out of all restrictions and can meet again face to face, because there's so many options and there's so many more places they can reach. I know churches that are streaming into prisons, for example, as a direct result of having to stream for their congregation. So it's been a challenging year for churches. It's been a challenging year for all of us, but I do think there's positives that have come out of this. And I said, I think broadcast will unlock some doors that maybe we weren't even aware of going forwards. So I do think we'll be talking more about this in the future and the coming years. So hopefully that was useful. I learnt a lot. So thank you guys and girls for watching. We'll see you really soon.